Music, one of the most dazzling fruits of human civilization, is today a massive global phenomenon. And so it's hard for us to imagine a time when, in centuries gone by, people could go weeks without hearing any music at all. Even in the 19th century, you might hear your favourite symphony 4 or 5 times in your whole lifetime, in the days before music could be recorded. The story of music, successive waves of discoveries, breakthroughs and inventions, is an ongoing process. The next great leap forward may take place in a back street of Beijing or upstairs in a pub in South Shields. Whatever music you're into, Monteverdi or Mantovani, Mozart or Motown, Masho or mashup, the techniques it relies on didn't happen by accident. Someone somewhere thought of them first. Music can make us weep or make us dance. It's reflected the times in which it was written. It has delighted, challenged, comforted and excited us. In this series, I've been tracing the story of music from scratch. Follow it on its miraculous journey. Misleading jargon and fancy labels are best put to one side. Instead, try to imagine how revolutionary and how exhilarating many of the innovations we take for granted today were to people at the time. There are a million ways of telling the story of music. This is mine. So far in this series, we've travelled from cavemen with their bone flutes to the industrial age, where large orchestras and frenetic pianists shook the bones of their weak-kneed audiences. We followed the leisurely unfolding of musical innovations in the medieval period up to the point in the 18th and early 19th century where they're coming at us thick and fast. By 1850, music's on fire and things have got grand, gutsy and gory. Supernatural love, destiny, death and immortality weren't invented in our own vampire-obsessed 21st century. The whole tragic love and fate thing became an obsession like no other for composers in the second half of the 19th century. They let loose a tidal wave of emotional roller coasters that left their audiences in a state of exhausted, bewildered arousal. In fact, it's hard to find a piece of music written between 1850 and 1900 that isn't about death and/or destiny. If you were looking for a starting point for this death and destiny craze in music, you could do a lot worse than a piece of music written by a deluded, brilliant, emotionally unstable French composer in 1829. The composer in question was a kind of cross between Beethoven and Lord Byron. His name was Hector Berlioz. His groundbreaking piece, Symphonie Fantastique. Berlioz's inspiration for his fantastical symphony was the legend of Faust, the intellectual who sells his soul to the devil in return for both knowledge and earthly pleasure. Here was a handy metaphor for the tormented, misunderstood genius whose gifts separated him from ordinary mortals. No wonder so many 19th century composers were attracted to the idea like moths to a flame. Berlioz was definitely separated from ordinary mortals. He was a borderline psychopath. But the music that poured forth as catharsis from his troubled mind was immensely influential on all the other composers of the century. Apart from anything else, he legitimised the idea that being isolated and mad were the best qualifications for being a composer. The French and Germans delved further into this morose and misanthropic frame of mind as the 19th century wore on, as we'll see. Thank goodness, then, for Italian opera. In Italy, tragedy in opera wasn't caused by pacts with the devil, but bad behaviour by humans. Well, men. In 19th century Italy, opera was a popular art form. I don't mean popular as in some people quite liked it. I mean popular as in everyone either went to or knew the songs from the latest operas. If you lived in Turin or Milan or Naples in 1850, opera was your iTunes. I know this seems strange when you think of modern-day opera, with seats costing £100 plus and posh folk in DJs, but for all of the 1800s, in Italy, opera was the people's entertainment. The giant who bestrode Italian opera in the last half of the 19th century was Giuseppe Verdi. Verdi remained at the top of his game from his first hit in 1842, Nabucco, to his last, Falstaff, an astonishing 51 years later. Throughout his long and gloriously successful career of 28 operas, Verdi managed to convey often complex emotions and plots in an easy-to-grasp, enchanting-to-sing Italian vocal style, so that ordinary folk... People who couldn't afford a ticket soon heard the big hits. Barrel organists and other itinerant musicians would hang around the theatres, learn the tunes and make a living playing them for punters in the street the next day. This was the mid-19th century equivalent of a jukebox. But even Verdi himself got caught up in death and destiny fever. To this already inflammatory mix, Verdi added sex. Take La Traviata, first performed in 1853. It's about a doomed love affair, climaxing in the tragic death from TB of the once promiscuous female protagonist, Violetta. Based on a recently published bestseller, The Lady of the Camellias by Alexandre Dumas, it was a huge hit. Of course, stories like The Lady of the Camellias allowed Victorian audiences to have their cake and eat it, to enjoy being spectators of what they thought of as lewd behaviour, then have their hypocritical morals endorsed by seeing the naughty woman who indulged in it die a horrible death. Not before she's broken their defenceless hearts, mind, with a farewell of choking beauty. La Traviata is accessible, tuneful and melodramatic. But its aim is to force its audience to confront its own prejudices and double standards. It's no coincidence that the figure of the fallen woman stalks through so many operas, novels and paintings of the second half of the 19th century. With increased male middle-class spending power came astonishing levels of prostitution. La Traviata confronts this male sexual hypocrisy, that every woman had her price and yet should be condemned for it, except in the theatre. So solid was the foundation Verdi created for populist Italian opera that he was able to hand over the torch to composers like Leoncavallo, Mascagni and especially Puccini, who carried it right into the 20th century. If it had been left to the Italians, classical music would have made it to the modern age without so much as a scratch. Still completely mainstream, still loved by everyone. But some combustible Berlioz fans north of the Alps took over the helm of the ship while Verdi wasn't looking, and all hell broke loose. And I mean, hell. Outside Italy, music in the second half of the 19th century was totally dominated by a French-speaking Hungarian born in what is now Austria. I'm talking about Franz Liszt. Yes, Liszt. His music may not be as well known these days as Brahms, Tchaikovsky or Wagner, but he was the guy all other composers, including those three, looked up to. He was the trailblazer, the experimenter, the pace setter. To do full justice to the death and destiny obsession, music needed to be turbocharged, and Liszt was the man who provided the rocket fuel. Disturbing emotions were conjured up in his harmonies, flashy set pieces thrilled and terrified a sensation-seeking public. Liszt was the composer who, more than anyone else in the 19th century, recalibrated music's forces. So it's worth looking in detail at some of the many innovations he brought to fruition. Liszt innovation number 1, the devil has all the best tunes. Liszt's Totentanz, Death Dance, triggered a craze for extravagantly ghoulish Halloween-style music, full of dark, deep, crashing chords and abrasive strings. It's a craze that has yet to abate. The legacy of this kind of up-tempo theatre of the macabre didn't just inspire composers of the period, like Saint-Saëns with his Danse Macabre, or Grieg's March of the Trolls, but also film composers of our own time, like the spookily brilliant Danny Elfman. In Batman, directed by Tim Burton, edge-of-the-seat action sequences are given an undercurrent of avenging menace by Elfman's Lisztian score. But Liszt's creepy death dance wasn't the only musical trick up his sleeve. Liszt innovation number 2, all the fun of the fair. Liszt was a spectacular pianist who more or less single-handedly, or should that be two-handedly, forced piano builders to adopt iron frames to replace wood frames because they simply broke under the hammering he gave them on stage. Liszt dazzled audiences with his use of the piano as a kind of fairground of effects. This is Liszt in lighter, crowd-pleasing mode. His Grand Galop provided the template for Offenbach's hallmark can-cans of 20 years later. In his 30s, Liszt became music's first international star. Some female fans became hysterical at the mere sight of him on the stage. But showy turns were only a fraction of what Liszt could do at the piano. Liszt innovation number 3, first impressions. He created a style that shimmered and gleamed, an aural equivalent of the blurred vibrancy of a painting by Monet, where sounds, like colours, melted and smudged into each other. This sparkling piece was written just 3 years after the first Impressionist exhibition had taken place in Paris in 1874. Liszt's incandescent paintings in sound were to be hugely influential on a younger generation of French composers, particularly Claude Debussy. Debussy's glimmering piano pictures owe a huge debt to Liszt, whom he revered like a disciple. Liszt's contribution to orchestral music was equally immense. Liszt innovation number 4, symphonic poems. He invented what he called the symphonic poem and wrote 13 of them to get the new form off to a cracking start. This is Liszt's symphonic poem Prometheus, inspired by the Greek myth in which the Titan Prometheus steals fire from Zeus to give to mankind. He's punished by being bound to a rock while a great eagle snacks on his liver every dawn for eternity. Pain and anguish saturate the music. The idea behind Liszt's symphonic poems was to reduce the traditional four-movement symphony, as perfected by Beethoven, into one concentrated shorter piece that would be a musical response to a non-musical artwork. By doing this, Liszt was moving away from the idea of music as an abstract entity of its own, where audiences listened attentively to 40 minutes of pure music, like doing a crossword or a brain teaser. His symphonic poems took just one scene, a character or a snapshot and wove the music around that. It was Liszt, more than anyone, who shifted the emphasis away from orchestral music as pure music to music that tried to illustrate something else. This, for example, is the opening of his symphonic poem Hunnenschlacht, the one inspired by a then famous mural of one of Attila the Hun's many battles. Fought in 451 AD against the now Christian Roman Empire and their allies, this was a rare example in which Attila and his heathen Huns got a sound thrashing. Liszt's musical response to the painting attempts to depict the ghostly armies of the battle mustering for the fight. Interspersed amongst the whispery strings are military outbursts from the horns. You'll notice in the painting that there are relatively few actual soldiers depicted. It's more ordinary men and women who've been engulfed unwittingly in the conflict. So Liszt is careful not to make his orchestra sound too percussive and martial, at least to start off with. Eventually, the battle proper kicks off, and if you look closely, you'll see the Romans carrying a gleaming golden cross. In the midst of the battle's tumult and chaos, Liszt introduces on the trombones an old plainsong chant, Crux Fidelis, Faithful Cross, to represent this image in the scene. The final 3 minutes or so of the piece has the plainsong theme interwoven into increasingly excited strings. Liszt rounds off his musical account of the painting with storming victory music, complete with extra brass reinforcements and a pipe organ. With the instruction, if it can't be louder than the whole orchestra, don't bother. This was music on a grander, supercharged scale than had ever been heard before, and when younger composers like Wagner and Tchaikovsky heard it, it thrilled and inspired them. For an audience in a concert hall, it was equally awesome. Liszt was setting a standard for everyone else to meet. If the atmosphere of the final climax sounds familiar to you, here's why. It's exactly the sort of grandiose and hyperventilated music you'll have heard over the years in countless movies. In Cecil B. DeMille's epic The Ten Commandments, made in 1956, Moses parting the Red Sea wouldn't be half as thrilling without Elmer Bernstein's stirring score. Liszt's symphonic poems, where the music conjures up the drama of a scene, is where the technique of how one might score a film began. And Liszt was also ahead of the curve on another 20th century development. Liszt innovation number 5, serial thriller. In his Faust Symphony of 1857, Liszt includes a melodic phrase that, while it might not sound all that revolutionary to our ears now, was to light a long fuse and prefigure a complete dismantlement of the basic building blocks of Western music. The opening theme of 12 notes may not be an instantly hummable melody.
But it does, as it happens, use up all 12 notes of the Western scale without repeating any of them. So what, you may say? Well, this is what. When the Austrian composer Arnold Schoenberg, 68 years later, proposed a new way of organising music whereby a melody could only use the 12 notes of the Western scale without repeating any of them, a method known as 12-tone serialism, it more or less brought about the collapse of musical civilization as we know it. No kidding. But Liszt had been experimenting with it in this symphony over half a century earlier with no fuss or bother.
Liszt had died by the time the only 12 notes never repeated idea really took hold. He might also have been appalled by the uses to which yet another of his list of innovations was eventually put, what used to be called musical nationalism, or, one might say, the ethnic heritage phenomenon.
Liszt innovation number 6. I can't get no self-determination.
In 1848, there were a series of revolutions all over Europe. Many of them were set in train by groups of people who shared a common language and culture, who wanted to gain independence from the various superpowers that controlled them. Most of all, the Austrian Empire, ruled from Vienna. One of the 1848 uprisings took place in Liszt's native Hungary. The rebels were crushed. Liszt composed a set of what he called Hungarian rhapsodies. They were certainly rhapsodic, but how genuinely Hungarian were they?
Liszt, like every other composer of his time, was a trifle confused about what indigenous Hungarian music actually was, believing it to be the same as gypsy music, which in turn was often muddled up with Turkish music. We now know they were all wrong, that gypsy music was separate and different from Hungarian folk music, and that the music they all thought was gypsy music was in fact Hungarian folk music played by gypsies in Budapest and other cities for the enjoyment of better-off Hungarian and Austrian patrons. The gypsies kept their own music to themselves. It's important to make one thing absolutely clear. The ethnic heritage phenomenon may have been motivated by a deep and sincere love of country and of the traditions and roots of peoples who felt bossed about by other more powerful nations, no doubt about it. But what it was not was a bottom-up grassroots movement whereby peasant troubadours presented the treasures of their communities to the world.
In all cases, the movement sometimes called nationalism in music was concocted by highly trained, sophisticated, well-travelled, middle-class composers who took bits and pieces of folk song and dance that they'd heard and tarted them up. The music that emerged was aimed at a mainstream audience who had no real interest in peasant culture whatsoever.
Amongst the most popular collections of the type were Brahms's Hungarian dances of 1869 and 1880, for example. They're great fun and a polished, accessible format by a man from Hamburg. But let's be honest about it. If you played one of them to a passing Magyar milkmaid on the banks of the Danube River in 1870 and asked her what it was, she'd have likely answered, "Nice, some kind of fancy German music."
The integration of pseudo-peasant style into the piano and orchestral mainstream was an unstoppable flood. To be fair, though, the fashion yielded many of the best-loved nuggets of 19th century music. Nowhere were the moral questions surrounding the borrowing of elements from ethnic music and putting them into mainstream music more fiercely debated than in the United States of America.